Okay, spray booths. So this is the school's spray booth. It's a downdraft spray booth. So you can see like this extra little bit along the top here, this blue chunk above the doors. That's where the air actually comes through the ceiling, goes down and gets sucked into the floor. So if we go in and look, you can see there's a grate in the floor. The grate in the floor sucks the overspray and exhaust out. This big huge filter in the top brings nice, clean, warm, dry air down all gentle all over the car, and then it sucks it out through the slot out of the bottom. That's our spray booth and why it's called the downdraft booth, because the air goes down, right? So besides that, the only other thing that a spray booth really is required, like you don't have to have a fancy downdraft spray booth like this, it just has to be an explosion-proof environment, right? So you can see all the lights are explosion-proof. They're behind sealed glass, and they even have these little glass break sensors in the glass. So if this was to break, the whole booth would shut off, because then it's no longer explosion-proof. So if you pull this whole lens out, there's actually like a rubber gasket in here. So the electricity, there's no electricity inside the booth, right? It's metal, it's 2 layers with an insulation in between, making it an explosion-proof environment. There's no sparks in here, nothing that can generate static electricity or any sort of ignition source, because when you're atomizing a spray gun, the atomized paint that's coming out is just like a fuel injector in a car, and it's explosive. So there's no chance that anything could actually explode in here or catch on fire, but just in case, we've got a bunch of sprinklers that will rain down water and put out a fire if there is one, right? So you'll never see any electricity in a booth. That's why you can't bring a radio or even a cell phone into a booth when you're spraying. It's an explosion-proof environment. And a lot of people think that you have a spray booth because it keeps the dust off of the paint. The real reason is safety. You can't have a body shop without a spray booth because it's illegal to paint on the floor, because there's nothing to control the poisonous fumes. There's nothing to stop an explosion or anything like that, right? So our booth, being a downdraft, has an intake stack. So if you look at, it's hard to point because, okay, right there, this metal box up here, that's actually the stack where it sucks in the air from outside on the roof of the school. It goes into this big blue box, which is basically like a humongous filter or furnace like you have at home. Goes through filters, goes through a fan down on the bottom, turns around, goes back up here through a burner, and then it goes into this thing here to distribute into the top of the booth, which is called the plenum, and it distributes it all through that intake filter and down into the booth where you're painting the car, right? And this is called the air makeup unit, because it makes up the air, pushes air in, the same amount of air that's being sucked out. And the air that's being sucked out is actually over on this side, which is the exhaust stack, right? So over here you can see another duct going through the ceiling of the school. This is where it exhausts outside. So it actually goes into the floor, goes through a tunnel like underneath in the ground, and then it goes up into here, into some filters, then into a fan, and then up into the atmosphere, and all the fumes go bye-bye, right? So there's 2 exhaust filters, one in the floor of the booth that we're going to check out later, one inside here, primary, secondary exhaust filters to make sure nothing gets caught up in the stack, nothing gets caught in the fan down there. And you can actually see the motor on this booth, we'll point at it, is right, come on, pointing finger down a little, right there. That's the motor for the exhaust, and it's actually outside of the exhaust stream, so the motor can cool effectively, and it can't make a spark and ignite anything because there's paint fumes all in the exhaust stack, right? And you can actually see the sprinkler pipe here going up and down. So there's actually sprinklers in the exhaust pipe. There's sprinklers in the tunnel underneath as well, and that's to stop a fire if there was a fire in there, because there's going to be overspray particles and stuff that can easily catch on fire, as well as fumes, right? So they keep the electric motor outside of the booth for, wait, pointing in the wrong direction over, yeah, right there. That electric motor is kept outside so that it doesn't overheat. It can stay nice and cool, because the temperature of the booth can be turned up, say if it's on a bake cycle or something like that. It also keeps it out of the overspray, so it can't potentially make a spark. The one on the intake side, it's actually inside the plenum, right? So we'll go over to the control here and turn it off, and I'll show you how to make sure that a booth is working properly, right? And part of the maintenance of the booth is something you have to do every day, right? And I'll go through some of the safety functions on the booth and some of the maintenance items on the booth, right? So this here is the main control panel for the booth. It's got the 120 power going in for the lights and sensors and stuff like that. And you can turn it off and on here. And then this is the 600 volts. The 3-phase, that's for the fans, the intake fan and the exhaust fan. And then there's a series of warning lights over here as well, right? Okay, so the safety checks actually start before you even start the booth, right? So for this man door here to get into the booth, I'm pointing in the wrong spot again, right there. That's a air interlock switch. So if you open the door, that air valve turns off and you can hear it leaking. There's another one over here on the front of the booth where that door, pointing at it right there, that door too, because this is another man door to get in and out. If either one of these doors are open, the big door in the front or the door on the side, you can't spray. It shuts off the air inside the booth. And there's a little air interlock switch right there on the back that's electronic. It shuts off the air for this pipe that goes into the booth here, right? So you don't get any air, right? So ours is leaking, so it actually needs to be adjusted. I've adjusted it a bunch of times. I built a little bracket a couple of times too. And because the top of the door there's just thin sheet metal, it keeps getting looser and looser all the time, right? Another instructor here made a really fancy one for the other door that's adjustable. And I got to make one like that for the other side. You can see it's got like a little nut, and you can adjust it in and out. You can see it's actually bending the door, right? But that one doesn't leak, so I'm gonna make one like that for it, right? So anyways, if we turn the booth on, this is the control panel for it. It has a bunch of different things in here. It has a key. This is for the power to get it going. This is the air makeup unit to bring it, the warm air in. This is the lights, left side, right side, and this little emblem here is to turn it on bake. This one with the spray gun is to turn it on spray. We're gonna turn it on spray. And when you hear it fire up and start, you have to listen, right? Because you don't want to hear any squealing. It could be a bad bearing. It could be a loose belt that's slipping as it's trying to turn over the fan. And it would give you an idea that it needs some sort of adjustment, right? So I'm going to close this door and listen to that thing hiss again. And we're going to watch now, because some of the other things in the booth. So this is an hour meter. This is to tell us when the booth needs service. This is our maintenance log for the booth for when it gets its service, when we change the filters or make any adjustments or something like that. It's to be maintained kind of like a car. It doesn't need oil changes though, it just needs filter changes, right? So one of the things we have to do is we have to constantly adjust the manometer. And this manometer has a little hose up here, if you can see, that's going into the booth. And that tells a pressure differential between atmospheric pressure outside and the pressure inside the booth. And it's way positive right now, right? So we have to adjust it down. And what this does is adjusts the speed of the motors, slowing down the one coming in and speeding up the one going out until it balances to 0, maybe a little too far, to 0, right? And then when we open the door, there shouldn't be any air coming in or out. It's just static, or even for a safety measure, it's best to actually adjust it a little bit negative. So when you do open the door, nothing gets sucked in as you do it, right? The temperature adjustment is here. The burner hasn't come on yet. We'll hear it flame on in a few minutes. It takes a few minutes to go through its safety checks and then decide to turn on. There's a light bulb burnt out, 2 light bulbs burnt out in here that need to be changed too. And then this is actually the timer for how long the bake cycle is. You just hear the click, the burner's coming on now. We should see this temperature going up. As the furnace is turned on, it's now warming up the air going inside, right? So this usually changes too when the burner comes on, because it has a different flow now as the power is being put into the air makeup. It's pretty close to 0. You want it 0 or a little bit negative. You never want it positive, because then it's leaching out chemicals into the shop. Something like that is probably perfect. And as you're painting, the filters are going to load up, and that's going to turn more positive as you're spraying anyway. So that's not too bad. It's ramping up. Now the sensors are going to say, well, there's too much heat. It's going to bring it back down, and it'll level out at 25.0 or whatever you set it to, following your technical data sheets and recommendations to the paint company. The only other thing on this control panel is there's an emergency stop on the side. It kills the whole thing in case something happens, like a belt breaks or something like that, or there's sparks flying out of somewhere, right? Okay, so the booth is working properly as long as that gets to 25 and stays there. Sometimes it goes down a little and comes back up and then like levels out. So we'll see if it works properly. It looks like it's doing a pretty good job. Slowing down a bit, getting close. Come on. Okay. Yeah, bingo. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and check the burner for operation, right? So this is the main control panel for the booth here, and this is actually a burner panel down here. So behind these weird stairs, there is a panel here that I'll show you later. It has all this stuff for the gas, right? And this is basically just like a humongous furnace. There's no difference than the one in your house, except it's 10 times bigger. So instead of like, I don't know, 40,000 BTUs, this is like 40 million BTUs, right? So if we go up here and we look inside this sight glass, you're gonna see a bunch of flames. And what you want to see when you look inside here is a nice even fire. We don't want to see, so if you see any yellow flames, you see any spots where flames are missing inside there, it should be nice and even. Everything should be blue and burning correctly, right? So we don't want to see any funny business in there. We want everything to look cool. If it looks weird at all, there might be a crack. There could be plugged ports inside it, and we would have to contact the spray booth maintenance company and a licensed gas guy to come and service it, right? So you can think of your furnace at home and the gas pipe that's going into it. This is a 3-inch diameter pipe that's feeding the natural gas into the spray booth. One of the reasons spray booths are so expensive to run, about $60 an hour, is the amount of natural gas they run. Unlike your furnace at home, it doesn't just re-warm up the same air that's in your house. It actually takes 100% of the cold air from outside and warms it up, and then 1 meter later shoves it all out there, or 1 minute later it shoves it all out the roof of the school and it's gone again, right? So it's doing a full air exchange of the entire volume of the booth every minute or so, right? So we'll go and check out the control panel. So the control panel, the 120 volts to 600 volts, we'll turn both of those off before we open this panel open. And with this little key, it opens up the panel and we see inside. And this is part of the controls for the booth. There's circuit breakers, there's fuses, and all kinds of different stuff in here. And what you want to do every once in a while is kill the power to it, the main switch as well. Some of these feeds that are coming in would still be live. Vacuum any dust that's out of here and just check and wiggle each wire and make sure none of these connections are coming loose. It's just a little tiny standard screwdriver to tighten them up and make sure they're tight. and that everything looks good. You don't see any burnt stuff, any carbon arcing, any scoring, any bubbly wires or anything like that. Everything should look cool, right? And this one looks pretty good. And you can actually see on spray booths, because they know they're in a body shop, they have a foam seal on all these to keep the dust out, right? Because they know it's going to be in such a dusty environment, right? So I'm going to turn the 120 back on, but I'm going to keep the 600 volts off because we're going to go and climb inside the booth, right? So if you look real close at that, yeah, I flipped that little switch open, and it's got a interlock or a lockout on it. So you can put a padlock on it, a padlock preferably that nobody else has the key. We have special ones at the school here for lockout that are red, and they all have a different key, and only the person who is in danger has that key, so nobody else can turn this on when I'm crawling around inside the booth, right? So that's how I make sure that the 600 volts is off. When I crawl inside the booth, I'm not going to get sucked through the fan, or something's going to turn on, or I'm going to get zapped or something like that. So the power is shut off, right? There's that interlock switch again for the air that goes inside the booth. This is the manifold that goes in right there. Also goes over to the other side for the manifold on the other side. Inside the control panel, very similar as well. Lots of stuff that's all hooked up in here to all the switches and controls. No fuses. There's one little relay in there, and that's it. And the buttons and stuff to the emergency stop. Same thing, make sure nothing is wiggled or loose, no dust. Everything's sealed up and good, okay? So that's all right. And I'll just show you guys too how sensitive the manometer is. If I just push on this, you can see it moving, right? Because I'm changing the pressure inside this control box now. That's different than what it's sampling inside the booth. If you're wondering if this is out of calibration or not, when everything's off, I have the door open to the booth. This should be at dead zero, so it's off by one little notch, right? Which is good to keep in mind, because if I set it at zero, it's not actually at zero, it's at 1 point, I don't know what that is, a quarter of an inch of mercury or whatever, inch of water. So yeah, look out for that as well. Okay, so back over on the plenum here. You can see the stack up here. The air comes down in through here. That's like a flap that closes when the booth's not in operation. Those are stepper motors that control a big flap inside there. It turns off when the booth's shut off to stop like squirrels and raccoons and rain and stuff from getting in. This is another valve that balances a pressure relief on the other side, where the air comes down and back up and through the plenum. It's like a divider in between. But inside here is the primary intake filters. It's the first filtration that's done to the air that's coming into this booth, right? So these filters here are what filter out the Scarborough, right? So if we look at them, they don't look so great. But if you put a light on through them, you can see they're about 50% plugged, right? So they're not fantastic. They probably should be changed. They're pretty gunked up, but they're not too bad. And it's like a lot of people think when the filter's dirty, it filters better, but you can actually see the filter being drawn through, because as they plug up, there's actually less holes for the air to get through, so the air actually speeds up going through these holes, right? And it'll start pulling dirt through the filter, right? So those are due to be changed. I think they've been changed once since we've had the actual spray booth, so they're not new by any means. So if you look inside here, we have the motor. It's a big, huge, like 20 horse motor, and that's why it can actually suck the air right through, or suck the dust right through the filters. If these get totally plugged, like around 80%, they'll actually tear right open, because this big fan and that big motor are really, really powerful, right? If we look up here, we can see right outside, I hit the emergency stop on the booth so the flapper wouldn't shut. You can see it goes right outside where it sucks in the air, okay? Comes through these primary intake filters, goes into that fan, and then gets forced back up the other side, right? So we're actually gonna crawl in here and inspect the belts, bearings, and the fan blades. Okay, so we're right inside the booth now, and I can see these belts are a little bit loose. It's time for them to be in adjustment. There is a spec for them. One's looser than the other, which isn't a good sign, right? And it's just like a car, you inspect it for cracks and glazing. That one's quite shiny. Oh, they're both pretty shiny. They're not in bad shape though. These are original too, from the booth installation, like 2006. And then if we come around here, if you can see, we actually want to spin it and take a look at the fans inside there, all the blades, make sure none of them are coming loose, there's none missing or nothing weird. When these go out of vibration, it's pretty serious, right? And this should all be very, very easy to turn. It's all on pillow block bearings, and very, very smooth, right? You don't want to feel anything weird, right? They use these like hamster wheel, they call them squirrel cage blowers because they're more efficient. They move more air and take less horsepower to spin them. And they're a lot quieter too, right? So we'll look down and you can see the motor is bolted to this skid on the floor. And that's the adjustment screw for it. Looks like it could use some oil, right? So you just loosen up the motor, you turn that and it'll pull it back and tighten up these belts, right? So that's what's going on inside here and how you inspect inside here. We also want to check for debris, if the booth is actually getting rusty. This is just galvanized. Once they're like 20 years old, they tend to get kind of rusty and they could be getting holes in them and stuff, right? And then it's sucking in shop dust instead of clean air from outside. Okay, so that's inspected. Gonna have to adjust the belts, gonna have to change these filters. And it's probably best to write it down as you go along. And it should all go in that little safety book. Now we're in the booth and we're gonna take a look at the secondary intake filters. So the primary intake filters that were filtering out the Scarborough air, which is probably a lot cleaner now since nobody's driving anywhere. It's a very coarse filter. It's not filtering down to a very fine particle. So this filter is the one that does the heavy lifting for making sure that dust doesn't end up in the paint job, right? So if we look at these ones, they're in pretty good shape. But because this is such a fine filter, because it does such a good job, it's like this would actually be a full-blown like HEPA filter. Like pollen wouldn't get through it or anything, right? But it takes a lot to clog it because there's very small particles that are getting through from the other filter. But you can see there's little black things and stuff in there, right? So there is some stuff. But I know these filters are fairly new and you can see there's not much stuff in them. So they're not getting restricted. There's no way they're drawing dust through them yet. And you can see up there, that's the plenum that distributes the air across the top of the booth. And it does it pretty evenly without any like special ducts or special diverters or anything like that, because these filters are so fine. It takes a lot of pressure to push the air through them. So it's kind of the filters that that distribute the air, because they're the big restriction in the intake to letting the air through, right? So you can see those little bits of stuff that are in there. They're far from clogged though, right? There's not a lot of debris in there. Definitely not drawing anything through them yet. Okay, so we can say those are good. Put it back up. And move on to the next one, which is the secondary exhaust, or the primary exhaust filter, the one on the floor. So now I'm going to point the camera down because these filters are in the floor. God, somebody dirt tracked over top of the things. So these are the primary exhaust filters. This catches like 99% of the overspray, and you can see the way the grates are designed. there's slots on the sides, and they load up from the outside towards the middle, right? And you can tell just by looking at this that it's not even half plugged, right? But this is a very, very coarse fiberglass filter, right? It's not very fine at all, but it still manages to catch 90% of the overspray, right? Because the air that's coming through here is perfectly clean already, and there's not any particles in it besides overspray. And the overspray particles are actually quite big when you're talking about dust. So it's easy for this filter to catch almost all of it, especially if it's installed properly. There's no holes or gaps or anything, right? And this one too, when it gets plugged up, you can't balance the manometer anymore, and it'll start like blowing open the doors on the booth, right? So typically this filter gets changed once a week in a regular body shop. The one up in the ceiling, it'll probably be once every 6 months or something like that. Those intake filters, the primary intake filters, it depends on where you are, right? If you're close to the highway, or if there's a construction site, or even I know from being up north, if you're up north, they get plugged with pollen and stuff like that a lot. They may need to be changed more often. Okay, so now we go over to the exhaust stack, which I showed you guys before. You can see the motor again. And we'll check out the secondary exhaust filters. These are not a flat filter, they're a pocket style filter, like the ones for the primary intake. And you can see these pocket filters, well, these are actually pretty plugged. And you can tell because the overspray is getting through them, right? It sucks in from the bottom and is being drawn through by the fan in the top, right? So these are definitely in need of being changed, and they're getting stiff because the overspray is quite crunchy. These things end up like a cracker, right? So these are pretty big filters, and they're held up with these rods. You should definitely wear a dust mask when you do this. But if we take a look at these filters, you can see all the overspray in them, right? So we'll take a look at these guys too. We should see that there's probably, yeah, see there's no light getting through them anymore. So these are actually being overcome by the fan. These will be close to ripping open soon, I would say. These should have been changed a while ago. Usually when you see these, they'll come white or blue. They should look white or blue. So you can see we've been painting white cars and red cars because the red and the white are actually getting through, right? So if we look down in here, this is the tunnel that connects the pit with the exhaust stack, and that's the sprinkler pipe in there. I think there's 2 sprinklers down in there in the bottom. You have to check this for water and then overspray buildup. When this gets like really heavy, you have to go through and scrape it all off because it's a humongous fire hazard, right? And then if we look up in here, we can see the other fan, the other squirrel cage, and this has to be inspected as well. This one is much more prone to damage due to the overspray that can develop in it. Also, it runs a lot hotter, so usually the bearings wear out quicker, the belts wear out quicker, and all that stuff because they're in the hot exhaust stream, right? You really have to watch and inspect the fans on the squirrel cage in this because they do get overspray built up in them, and then they'll flake off and imbalance the motor, and it can lose blades. Or not the motor, the squirrel cage, you can lose blades, affect the bearings and all kinds of different stuff. So you got to scrape them usually like once a year. If you take really good care of your filters, maybe once every 2 years or something like that. But it's part of the maintenance if you want the booth to last and not be dangerous in any way, right? So here we are inside the exhaust stack, inspecting it. You can see the squirrel's cage on the motor has to be inspected from both sides. It sucks from both sides. It's really heavy duty compared to the other side because there is much more danger of damage. And this one has the tougher job drawing the exhaust out. So we'll inspect the belt, spin the bearings and all kinds of stuff like that, make sure it's okay. So you can see inside the exhaust stack there's a sprinkler right there, right? Okay, that's about it.